Hello everyone, myself Arup Maitra. Today I would discuss a topic how to create AWS Lambda function from .NET Core Web API. So before we start, what is AWS Lambda? AWS Lambda is a serverless event-driven compute service that let us run code for virtually any type of application or backend service without provisioning or managing servers. We can trigger Lambda over around 200 AWS services and software as a service application. And most important thing is that we need to pay only for what we consume or compute as part of this resource that is called the AWS Lambda. So before we go to the practical demo, let's quickly visit that what are the prerequisites to create the .NET Core Web API and host into the AWS Lambda. We need Visual Studio 2019 or 2022 or VS Code. Secondly, we use an AWS account. It can be a free account or paid account. Third, we need .NET Core SDK, either 3.1 or 6.0 long-term support. So I would use 6.0 long-term support, but today in this world, like we can use any other version of the .NET Core SDK. It can be 5.0 or 7.0 as well. We would use Postman, which is optional, but in this video, I would show you how to enable the Swagger and how to validate the API from the Swagger. So let's quickly launch the Visual Studio 2022 that I would use as part of this demo. Click on File and click on New and Project. I would create a new project. So I would choose .NET Core Web API. In the project name, let's put a project name. So let's say AWS Lambda demo function. This is the directory. If we want to place the solution and the project in a different directory, then we need to disable this checkbox. Otherwise, I would keep this checkbox enabled. Next. Then in the framework, I would use .NET 6.0, that is long-term support. Authentication is none to simplicity for the simplicity of this POC or the demo, and configure for HTTPS. I would not enable the checkbox for enable Docker because I would not creating any Docker image. But in future videos, I would show you how to deploy this .NET Core Web API and build it as an image and deploy it with the AWS Lambda. Then use controllers. So I would use controllers, but we can use the minimal APIs as well. If we don't want to create the controllers, then we can keep disable this checkbox. And to enable the Swagger, we need to keep this checkbox on. That is called the enable open API support. So I would enable the open API support for Swagger. So let's click on create. So it will create the web API within 10 to 15 seconds. So my web API has been created successfully. If we go to the Solution Explorer, we can see in the controllers there is a default controller which is called the weather forecast controller. It has a default constructor and it has one simple action method, that is get weather forecast, which will return random 5 forecast reports in the response. For this controller, we have a default weather forecast model with required attributes, and this is the entry point, which is called the now, as I mentioned that uh, we can create also the minimal API over here. So I will create a minimal API called app.map.get, and this is a API which will return a text response that is welcome to AWS Lambda Function. Okay, now let's quickly build the app solution. Build has been succeeded. Now run the solution and see that whether my APIs are launching properly or not. So it will create the Swagger by default. So you can see the Swagger URL has been launched successfully, and we can see there are the two functions or two action methods. One is the slash API, which is the minimal API that we created from program.cs, and another is that the slash weather forecast, which is part of the weather forecast controller. Now click on API, click on try it out, and click on execute. We can see that the response, the welcome to AWS Lambda function. Similarly, if we click on the weather forecast, then click on try it out and click on execute, we can see that in the response body, the 5 different types of weather forecast report has been generated. So So all good from the .NET Core Web API. Web API is running perfectly fine. Let's quickly close this. Now the next step is how to convert this .NET Core Web API into a AWS Lambda function. To do so, we need to create or install a NuGet package by clicking on the Manage NuGet Packages, and we need to install the amazon.aws.aspnetcodeserver.hosting, so which I have already installed as part of this application. Mm, Not installed, sorry. We need to install it. So it is saying that it's package for running ASP.NET Core applications using the minimal API style as AWS Lambda function. So this package would basically help us to convert our .NET Core Web API into AWS Lambda. And I will use the latest table 1.6.0. So click on install and I would accept it. So we can see that the AWS Lambda ASP.NET Core hosting package has been installed successfully. Now, if we click on the solution and if we go to the CSProj file, we can see that it has been included into the CSProj as well with the latest version of 1.6.0. Now, the next step is that we need to register this from our program.cs. So, if we go to that and click on builder.services.add AWS Lambda hosting, which will take a Lambda event source dot. It will take the three type of event source. One is application load balancer, one is HTTP API, and the REST API. For this demo, I would choose the HTTP API. So now our web API is ready to fully convert to the AWS Lambda. But before we deploy into this application into the AWS Lambda, if we click on the solution, right click on the solution and see that there are only two properties available, publish to AWS and publish to AWS Elastic Beanstalk, but there is no option to publish to AWS Lambda. Now how to do this, we will see right now. Enable this AWS Lambda options, so we need to add a property group here called AWS project type, which is Lambda, and magically, like if you can see that it will enable this option if you right click on the solution, and you can see the publish to AWS Lambda option is available right now. So this property group is basically enabling this option. Now, how actually I can see this published to AWS Lambda? So for to do that, you need to go to the extensions. You need to install this AWS toolkit from the inside the tool inside the extension, in the manage extensions. So I have already installed it. You need to install it as well. So in the search box, if you search the AWS toolkit, you can see I have already installed that AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio 2022. So you need to install it before start this project. Okay, now, so if I go to the, before I publish to the, publish to the this web API into the AWS Lambda, let's go to the AWS Management Console. So we can open this AWS Management Console by, let's quickly showing you aws.amazon.com, and from here we need to click on the AWS Management Console under the My Account, and it will redirect you to the AWS console homepage. So here in the recently visited, we can see the Lambda and the other resources are already available, but also for the first time users, we need to search this resource from the search bar called Lambda, and we can see the resource or service is available in, upon the search query. So click on the Lambda. So we can see that this is the default Lambda AWS Lambda homepage when we don't have any Lambda function. So at this moment, as we do not have any Lambda function yet created yet, so we'll create a brand new Lambda function right now. To do this, right click on the solution, click on the publish to AWS Lambda. So another important thing is that once we will configure the AWS or install the AWS toolkit. At the same time, after the AWS toolkit installation, we need to create a default role and users to configure from the Visual Studio so that we can deploy the application or the APIs into the AWS without any hassle. So that's why I have already created a default profile for me, and from the AWS configure sections, I will show you in a different video how to create that role and how to configure it so that you can check my video before doing this. In the region, I am using the US East North Virginia. So US East 1. So I can show you here in the portal as well. So you can see the US East North Virginia. So I am using, and the package type will be zip, and the Lambda runtime I am using .NET 6, and the function name, let's say Lambda Function Demo API. Oof, the function spelling is wrong. Yeah. Description, let's say deploy .NET Core Web API into AWS Lambda. This is optional, and configuration is release, framework is 6.0, which is default, and the handler name. So this is very important. The handler name needs to be matched with the namespace, that is AWS Lambda Demo Function. Now click on next. So once we click on next, then it will show the role name. The role name we need to choose from here, so which we will choose the AWS basic execution role. So AWS basic execution role is basically allows us to do the or giving the permissions to write the CloudWatch logs as well. I will create a separate video that how to create logs and host into the CloudWatch. So how we can monitor those logs from the CloudWatch. So that we'll see in a different video. Now for this time select this role, and the execution, the memory is 256, which is the second lowest. So I will keep it as a default for this demo purpose, and the timeout is 10 seconds. We can configure it and then as a different value. And the other options, debugging and error handling and the VPC, I am not changing any. So let's click on the upload. So it will take around a minute to upload this ASP.NET Core Web API into AWS Lambda. So we can see here that the role has been created and it's attached the policy as well, that is AWS basic execution role to role Lambda. And right now it is executing the publish command. So it's zipping all the DLLs, and yes, the API has been successfully deployed into the AWS Lambda. So you can see the last updated status as successful. Now quickly go to the AWS Lambda. If we refresh this page, or if we go to the console page 1 and click on the search the Lambda again, sometimes it takes a while to reflect. So click on Lambda and functions. Yes, we can see the Lambda function demo API has been created successfully. With the description, let's deploy the .NET Core Web API into AWS Lambda. Now click on the function. We can see the function has been created. We got a function ARN, and we can see the code properties and runtime settings, all which I have set during the deployment. In the configurations also, there are the multiple options. So you can see the general configurations with the memory, snapshot, and the infra storage. All we can see here. In the permissions, we can see the basic execution rule that we have chosen, that we can see here. Now, if we click on the function URL, we need to create the function URL to see that whether our API is perfectly hosted into the AWS function URL or not. But before we create the function URL, just wanted to show you one more thing here. Once we deployed or published this ASP AWS Lambda demo function into the AWS Lambda, then automatically AWS generates our AWS Lambda tool defaults.json template. And this template is basically have some required attributes that automatically created, that is region, profile, configurations, framework, function name, description, package type. So these are all the things that we have chosen during during the publish of this ASP.NET Core API. So now we can create the function URL from the Amazon App Console. So while creating this function URL, there are the two options of the auth type. One is AWS IAM. This is option is only for the authenticated IAM users and roles who can make this request for this function URL. And another option is the none. So none is basically Lambda would not perform IAM authentication or request for this function URL, and this URL endpoint will be public for unless you implement its own authorization logic in your function. So for the production of the real use cases, this none option is not recommended because it's only for the testing or for the such kind of the demo purpose. So I created the none so that I can test it without any authentication. Let's click on save. So, so if we browse this function URL, then we can see, yeah, that this is an error which is very much obvious because we don't have any root API which is called as a slash. So we have a minimal API called slash API. If we click on enter, then we can see that our API is successfully returning the result that is welcome to AWS Lambda function. Now, if we l- load the Swagger slash index.html, we would see an error because Swagger is enabled only for the development. Let's see. Yes, that's right. So Swagger is not loading. Now let's see why. Because if we come here, we can see it is mentioned that if app.environment is development, then only the Swagger will be generated or Swagger will be able to load from the browser. So to do that, to enable this, if we go to the properties and launch settings.json, then we have an environment variable called the ASP.NET Core environment whose value is development. So if we go to the Lambda function and if we come to the configurations, then below the function URL, we can see there is a tab called the environment variable. Now click on edit. We can add environment variable here. Then we can put the name as ASP.NET Core underscore environment and the value will be development. Now click on save. So the environment variable has been successfully saved. If you go see that, you can see that the ASP.NET Core environment key and the value is the development. Now, if we reload the URL, then we should see the Swagger. Yes, we can see the Swagger has been loaded successfully. We can see there are the two functions, one is slash API and is weather forecast. Let's quickly validate those two APIs. So click on the slash API and try it out. Click on execute. We can see welcome to AWS Lambda function. Similarly, like if we click on the slash weather forecast, then and click on try it out and click on execute, we can see the in the response body, the 5 random temperatures where the weather forecast has been returned. So that's the way we can easily create an ASP.NET Core Web API into AWS Lambda. In the next video, I will quickly show you that how to host this AWS Lambda API in front of the API gateway. So API, so we would use the our external applications or the clients would use the API gateway to invoke this AWS Lambda function. So the clients would not have direct access to the AWS Lambda function. Instead of that, they would use the API gateway in front of it and and they can use the Lambda function. They will be able to access the Lambda function via this API gateway. So that's it for today as part of this demo. If you like this video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to click on the bell and the notification so that when I publish a new video, automatically you will get the notification. I usually use to create the videos for .NET, AWS, Azure, and DevOps. Thank you so much and see you soon.